fun. Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to another in a series of noon lectures sponsored by the Associated Student Speakers Program. Today, directly following the speech, there will be a question and answer period. There are 2 floor mics set up on either side of the room. If you'd like to ask a question, if you can find the mic, glad to take them all. Today we are privileged to have with us a public servant who's been serving America for all of his adult life. At the present time, he's a visiting professor at the University of Minnesota and at Macalester College. He continues as a member of the Board of Regents of the Smithsonian Institution and was recently elected to the Board of Trustees at Brandeis University. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the former Vice President of the United States, Mr. Hubert H. Humphrey.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Richard Marks, and my special thanks to Janie Robbins that came down to greet us, and I lost her. Well, there she is, right over here. And Janie, you ought to stand up. You're the best that they're going to have here today. And I do want to thank the UCLA Associated Student Speakers Program for including me in on this occasion. I asked Richard what he expected from me, and he said, more than you're going to give. I didn't expect that was the answer that I would receive, and I said, do you want this strictly informal question and answer? And he said, well, we would like to have you sort of hold forth for a while on whatever you'd like to talk about. Then from there on out, we'll have the questions. And that's the way I'd like it. Now, I have returned to the classroom, not voluntarily, but I have returned. Some 25 years ago, I was a professor of government, and then I decided that I would like to practice some of what I had been teaching, and I think that's what got me in trouble. But I have felt, since having been in government for some 24 years, that all that I once taught in the courses in American government, I should say all the students that I taught, were entitled to a refund. Because compared to what was written and what I taught and what happens and what I've seen, well, it just doesn't match. That's all. I came to college campuses many times in my years of 16 years in the Senate and 4 years in the vice presidency. And when I was vice president in particular, I would say something like this, that I'm a refugee from a classroom. And people would say, well, that's good. That's one of the things that helps education. And then I'd look around and jokingly I would say, I want the president of the university, if he was available, if he could get out of a building or get in it, if he was around, I would say I'd like to have him know that my credentials are in good order. I'd look for the member of the Board of Regents or Trustees and tell them that I'd tried to keep up to date. And I said, you know how public life is, particularly elected public life. It's so precarious and so uncertain. And then I would chuckle a bit, thinking that was all a joke. I never realized how persuasive I turned out to be. I've made the complete circuit. And here I am back again as a visiting professor to my own home university, to a very fine private college, a member of a board of trustees of one of the most exciting and creative universities in America, and still actively engaged in the work of education at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, of which I am privileged to serve as chairman. I want to talk to you today about some of our domestic concerns. I know that tomorrow, or very shortly, that you will have a very distinguished man here, Dr. Ralph Bunch, who will undoubtedly be able to enlighten you on many matters of international concern. But this meeting is open for all forms of questions. I did not come here to recruit Lou Alcindor. I want you to know that before we start. Even though I've had one or two whisper to me that if I could make any contact, it would be worth my time. But I've decided to teach, not to be a broker. So I'm going to try to do a little of that today. I asked Richard and Janie on the way to this meeting about some of the activities of UCLA, because every great university has a host of activities that are all too seldom reported or known by an interested public. I know, for example, of your Unicamp for your disadvantaged and handicapped in this community. I wish more people in America knew that about UCLA. I wish they knew that it was primarily financed out of the student activity, out of your Mardi Gras and other programs. I wish they heard that part of student life. I wish that more of our fellow Americans knew about the tutorial work that goes on voluntarily from thousands, and indeed many thousands, of gifted and talented university students. I wish that the word of the Venice Project would get a little bit further east than just the boundaries of the state of California. I wish that people who are so concerned these days and critical would know of your high potential program for particularly students in minority groups that have high potential and through no fault of their own have been denied a chance to be fully and prepared under the terms of orthodox university regulations and standards for a university career. This is a part of the student action that isn't reported. I also think that it's time that the American educational community, those responsible for it, recognize that there is a desperate need and a critical need for a reevaluation of many of the campus rules, much of the administrative structure, and the relationship between administration, faculty, and student. I have very personal views about this. I've never seen any reason at all why it required disturbance to get programs of Afro-American studies. I would have thought that those of us that are educators or claim to be would have been out in front on that a decade ago. Indeed, we should have been. I think that we ought to recognize by now that in the non-academic areas of college life, that students must have a very prominent role, if not the controlling role, in their rules and regulations. Otherwise, these rules will not be abided by. I think we also ought to recognize that there is a deep concern amongst many students who expected to get some good teaching, that they'd see their teachers and that they'd see their professors. Now, I'm not going to spend much of my time in the next few years on research. I'll let you in on a secret. There are warehouses full of research. And I happen to believe that research is needed and it must be continuing. I am a person that believes in basic research in the field of sciences. I believe in research in the field of the humanities, of social science. But I do not believe in research for research's sake. I believe that a university is what was once described in Greek literature, Socrates on one end of a log and a student on the other. It's the dialogue between teacher and student. It's a feeling of community and of the ability to communicate. Everybody likes to talk these days about the generation gap. Well, as one who's been around a bit, I've seen some young men and women at age 18 or 20 that were already, that is in terms of their attitude, ready for Social Security and Medicare. I found some like that. I found a few at the ages of 65, 70, and 75 that were ready for a piece of the action. So I think that one can say that it isn't so much a generation gap as it is possibly a communications gap. And we're all so busy. We're all so big. Institutions are so big. Government is so big. Universities are so big. Business is so big. Everything is so big and computerized that we have lost some of the human element which is vital to the educational process. So I intend in the few months that I may be privileged to teach, or years, to try to spend my time making teaching popular and making teaching not just research and writing, but making teaching what it ought to be, communication, where the professor may learn more than he teaches, and where the student may feel a sense of rapport with the man that is on the other side of the desk, so to speak, or on the other end of the log. Now, why is it that we have a great deal of concern running through our campuses and all through our community? There are many reasons, and you can pick individual incidents, you can pick a particular event and say that's it. That's what triggers it. But let's just take a look at the kind of a society in which we live. It's in many ways a great and magnificent social structure. In many ways, it's a great and unbelievably successful economic structure. In many ways, it's the best that man has been able to create in terms of a political structure. But in many ways, it isn't. And to a sensitive people, it's the gaps, it's the weaknesses, the limitations that caused concern and finally cause trouble, unless those limitations and weaknesses and injustices are corrected. Now, I'm talking to an audience that is generally described as the now generation. Get it done now. Well, much of what we need to do can be done now. Some things can't. And I happen to believe that frank and straight talk, to the best of one's ability, with the limitations of his background and knowledge, is the best way to communicate. It isn't really important that a professor be popular. It is important that he speak his mind and that the student have the same privilege. That there be an exchange of thought on the basis of intellectual integrity, and that there be communication and not just words. Here we see a situation, hunger in this country, and real hunger, not just malnutrition, but people going hungry in a society that for over 30 years has been complaining about food surpluses. And thank God, at long last, there's an interest in the American public, and particularly amongst young people and amongst others, to see that something can be done about it. Now, this is a problem that can be answered now. If you put yourself to this one, we can get it done now, in this Congress, in this year, in this administration, in this country, so that by the year 1970, not a single man, woman, or child in America is without an adequate diet. Now, that's something for the now generation, and we can do that. And I hope that you'll bend your efforts to it and study it carefully. When I just give young people a word of advice, when you run up against establishment, be careful that you have your facts right, because frequently the leader of the establishment, as they put it, will find you on some miscalculation of minor significance, and that'll become the whole frame of argument. So be sure of your information. And you don't need to worry. There's plenty of information that you can be sure of, and if you're doubtful, cast it aside, because you'll have a big enough case with what is positive, certain, sure, and sound. So the hunger in the midst of plenty, it's politically dangerous, it's economically indefensible, and it's morally wrong. All of which I think makes a pretty good case for doing something about it. It costs something, yes, but not much. In this fantastic budget of ours and this economy that's approaching the $1 trillion figure, It is said that for less than $1 billion we can see to it that not a single man, woman, or child in this country goes without an adequate, balanced diet. Well, that's something that we can do. Unemployment. Now, this is a little more difficult. In the greatest industrial boom that the nation has ever known, what kind of unemployment? Hardcore unemployment. Why? Because many of the people that today are without jobs have never had training for the job. They have no industrial orientation. They are like foreigners in a strange country. Whose fault? Theirs? Obviously not. Separate but equal? Never was. It was separate and unequal all the time. And you and I know it. Now, when I hear people say to me, for example, well, we got to give everybody an equal opportunity now, I say, well, you're going to lose that game right now. People who have been denied for a century must have more than equal opportunity. They must have an extra dose of opportunity. And we're going to have the patience and the perseverance and the creativity to find ways and means of inspiring motivation, of bringing skills or semi-skills to people who have none, and of following through. We bring in this great nation of ours, if a person comes in from Cuba, and they're surely welcome, the government of the United States tries to be of some help in orienting that person to a new environment and follow through for a job. Well, what about a fellow American that may come from Alabama or Mississippi or South Carolina or Minnesota or California that is without skills, without a good education, without a cultural background that equips him for life in the great urban centers? Are we to ignore them and say, well, individualism, freedom of choice, the choice being what? More of the same, only worse. Poverty. 10 years ago, if a speaker came to this campus and talked about poverty in the United States, the student body and the faculty, with few exceptions, would look at him and say, what's he talking about? Oh, sure, there are a few poor people around, we know that, but mainly because they don't want to work. That's what they used to say. And then finally, some of the great spiritual leaders in this country and social leaders in America, people in the academic life and in the fields of social work and the humanities, found that poverty was not just an occasional blight, but it was here, indigenous, cancerous, malignant in substantial measure. And while it is true that we haven't done nearly what we need to about it, we have recognized the problem as a nation in public policy for the first time, not merely to see to it that the poor had something to eat, which is still a matter to be fulfilled in many instances, but that we recognize poverty in all of its dimensions and tried to do something constructive to eradicate it. Poverty in the midst of untold wealth, that's why it's so blatantly wrong. That's why people rebel. That's why there is such deep tension and frustration. Because you and I know it doesn't need to be. There may have been a time that people could be poor because there wasn't any way to correct it. But believe me, that's not the case today. Now, we don't know all of the answers, and I appeal to this student body to be understanding. I appeal to you to be innovative, creative, experimental. We do not know how to cure cancer of the body. But we do not throw out every scientist and doctor that fails in an experiment. We say, try it again, doctor. Go at it again, Mr. Technician. Here's another grant of funds. Follow this idea. Follow this particular approach. And for better than 50 years, the medical profession of this land has been searching relentlessly for an answer to cancer in all of its forms. And we've made some progress. And we hail every progress and we say it's great good news. Well, there's another kind of cancer of the human spirit called poverty. And for thousands of years we have looked at it as if it were like leprosy and isolated the poor. And now at long last we say maybe we can treat it maybe we can find an answer. And we experiment. And when we experiment with public funds and some of it's wasted, immediately there is an investigation. And then somebody says it's boondoggling, and somebody says it's corruption. When we ask the poor to help manage their own affairs, when they've never had a chance in their lives to manage anything and they make a mistake, we say abolish the community action programs. Ladies and gentlemen, the way to develop a mature individual is to give him the responsibilities of maturity. And many of the poor and the deprived in this country and the disadvantaged have been denied any chance to have responsibility for their lives. They've had no chance to have anything to say about their decisions that affect their lives. And if in the next decade, as we try to give them that opportunity to make decisions affecting their lives, they make some mistakes, be as tolerant of them, will you, as you are of the doctor that has gained fame and a Nobel Prize, who may have spent 25 to 30 years making one mistake after another until he found the answer. Just be that tolerant. And you're going to have to take a stand. Because just as surely as I'm looking at you now, there will be a wave, a move in this country to try to turn back on some of these programs. I don't say they're all good, some should be discarded. But I say when we succeed in one endeavor, we should build from it, and we must be willing to innovate. And here we live at the time of urban life. What is the characteristic of modern society? Urbanization, for which we're poorly prepared physically, emotionally, intellectually, and economically. Urbanization, the vast movement of people not only in America but all over the world to the cities. From the mountains, the Andes, into Lima, into Santiago, Chile, into Rio, into city after city, from the fields of India into Calcutta, and from America that was only 50 years ago essentially a rural society into a nation today that has 70% of its population on 2% of its land, and which in the next few years, in the next 25 years, will double that population. And we'll need to find 19 million more acres of land for urban development. Magnificent cities with libraries and museums and commercial structures and stadium and orchestras and factories and parks and streets. Magnificent cities. A city in which you can build a magnificent new commercial building, an office building of 50, 100 stories high, and within its shadow the filth of humanity. We know how to build. The magnificence of the city with the filth and the ugliness of the ghetto. Is it any wonder that people are bewildered? Is it any wonder that there's a sense of frustration? Now, I suggest that we turn that frustration and bewilderment into constructive purpose. I suggest that we start to make the kind of a commitment that this country needs. And I've suggested it for a long time. In reference to our cities, I've said we needed to do for the American city, which in many ways is as demolished as the city of Western Europe after World War II, that we needed a Marshall Plan for our cities. And what do I mean by that? A long-term commitment, adequate sums of money, planning, cooperation between the donor and the receiver, and considering human values as well as physical structure. Don't tell me we can't do it. We can build 45,000 miles of interstate highway in this country at the cost of millions of dollars per mile, and we can build it on schedule. We can build commercial recreation facilities. We can put the Apollo 8 and the Apollo 9 ahead of schedule. The most intricate type of design and engineering and technology that the world has ever known. We can create a beautiful, perfect environment for man to go to the moon. But we can't do it in Los Angeles. Isn't that amazing? And in our society, it isn't a question of either or. It's a question of doing it together. Many times I have indicated to some of you and others that a society or a nation that can put a man on the moon and pay for it and do it ought to be able to help and be willing to put a man on his feet right here on earth to do it and to pay for it. We can do it. Now, what are some of the dimensions of this problem? People like to talk about the urban crisis. Well, what do you mean by crisis? You know, the trouble of this day and age is we use adjectives so generously that you hardly know which one means anything anymore. You see somebody, you say, you're beautiful, when you know darn well they're not. And you see somebody and you say, well, I hope you're feeling well, when you really haven't that feeling at all. We say a lot of things. It's a pattern that today, and we have the extravagant language, and I'm as guilty of it as everybody else. Crisis. What is it? I figured I'd get a response out of that. All of you Republicans that have to go to class, why, you can go, and after a while. But I want all the dissident Democrats to stay because we're trying to patch up things now, you know. You ever thought about who's president when Mr. Nixon's out of town? This is what used to worry the country when President Johnson left and I was around. Why, when you're vice president, you live for those moments. I'm always being deflected here, but I read where Professor Goldman had something to say about abolishing the office of the vice president. I hope that we'll get around to that in the question period because I want to take him on here. After all, it's a good place to do it. Well, what about this? What do we mean by crisis? Let's define it. I'll tell you what we mean by crisis. The worst schools, the poorest schools in the areas that need them the most, that need the best schools. The poorest education in the areas where the people need the best education. That's crisis. And that is a fact in all too many cities across America. Secondly, the fewest number of garbage collections in the area where there's the most garbage because there's the most people who need sanitation protection. That's crisis. The high rates of crime in areas where police are needed more often and better police, and there are fewer of them and lower grade police. Unemployment and low income or sub-unemployment or subemployment amongst the blacks, the Mexican American, the Puerto Rican, and other minority groups. Unemployment where employment is needed. Pollution. The pollution of water, the pollution of air, which has no respect for ethnic group, income, or area. That's crisis. Housing. And let's just lay it on the line. There is no way to correct the ills of the modern city until you give people decent housing and provide decent housing for them in which to live. And that is, that's a must. Let me give you an example. The late Senator Robert Taft, who was no revolutionary, in cooperation with Senator Allen Ellender of Louisiana, who isn't any revolutionary, were the authors of the Housing Act of 1949. And they said in that act that every American is entitled to a decent home, to decent housing. They prescribed in that act, 1949, that we would build 135,000 units of low-income, low-rent public housing every year for 6 years, 810,000 units. That was 1949. 20 years have gone by. And in the 20 years, we've built less than 500,000 units. When it was required in the Act of 49, before this urban crisis was so visible, that we would build 810,000 units in 6 years. Why? I'll tell you why. Because legislators listen to public opinion. Because the legislators were convinced that low income, low rent, public housing was not wanted. So that today the poor people of America are more poorly housed now than they were 10 years ago. And you want something to act on? I'm going to make a suggestion. I'd like to help save the world too. But frankly, it's a big job. I've worked at it a little bit, and I'm not weary. I do become a little concerned as to whether I'll live long enough to make it. But I'll tell you one place to start saving it. Right here. In this university, in this city, in this county, where you can look at what you're doing, see what you're doing, see whether what you're doing is effective. The best foreign policy is a working, effective domestic policy. And you're not going to abolish poverty in the world until you make some inroads on it right here in the United States of America. Of course, that isn't quite so dramatic as some of these other things. I know that. You can be such an expert on some parts of the world that you've never visited. So easy. But try to be informed on the part of the world where you live. And the sum total of the parts makes the whole. And finally, the issue of race tells us what the crisis is. And America is a unique country in this. We're multiracial, not just biracial. And we are right at the point in our history where we're going to determine whether or not this will be an integrated society, and I don't mean a non-segregated, I mean an integrated society, in which we recognize that there is one race called the human race, or whether or not we're going to be the society that the Kerner Report spoke about. Separate and unequal, whether or not we're going to have American apartheid, whether we're going to have separatism here, or whether we're going to learn to live as a community. And may I say that the problem of the city focuses attention upon it all, because the neglect of the city today is an example of the neglect of the minorities. Because more and more of the blacks, the Puerto Ricans, the Mexican Americans, the Indians, and others have moved to our inner cities. And when I see my white brethren go to the suburbs and ring the center city with a white band and see the city services of the inner city and the center city die because of lack of revenue and even sometimes lack of talent, I say that's the worst form of discrimination. And all the pronouncements and all the brotherhood campaigns put together cannot erase it. There's only one way to meet the problems of this country that are tied up in what we call race. And that's to start to treat people like people. I heard an old minister say, and I know this isn't very fashionable these days, but so be it. Everybody has his right to have his own idea of his own faith. And he said, the way you treat people is the way you treat God. And I suggest that the greatest contribution that the American student can make to the world is to talk about people. P-E-O-P-L-E or P-E-E-P-U-L if you want it that way. Just people. How do we think about them? Not black people, not white people, not brown people, not red people, but people. And start to recognize that the great resources of this country, the great potential of this country, is yet to be discovered in those people. Well, now they say, well, what are you going to do about all this stuff? That's a great idea, Humphrey. What are you going to do about it? Well, first thing you got to know is what's the problem. I think we've made enough studies. I don't think we've taken them seriously. That's the problem. That's number one. Well, we've done something. We've made some advances. We ought not to minimize them. The breakthroughs, the beginnings are very important. Model cities, which for the first time coordinates all of the many governmental programs for both physical and human rehabilitation, puts a premium upon community planning, puts a premium upon local action. The Housing Act, which is the most far-reaching housing program, the Act of 1968, good, but it has yet to be implemented. We've just put down the cornerstone. Question is whether you're ever going to build any housing under it. It pledges 6 million low-income housing units in the next 10 years, not 810,000, but 6 million. Let's see whether we get at it. Let's see whether the bond issues will be voted. Let's see whether or not the taxes will be collected. There are some other things that are needed. An urban development bank. You can't finance the American city with conventional financing any more than you could have financed the opening of the West without the Federal Land Bank, any more than you could have financed the development of REA without the Rural Electrification Bank administration. It took governmental action in cooperation with private resources. And until we start to find the money, as one mayor said not long ago, they said, "What are the problems of the city?" He said, "There are three: money, income, and revenues." Cities today are bankrupt, literally bankrupt, unable to sell their bonds, unable to provide their services. And here we sit with an obsolescent, obsolete governmental structure, federal, state, and local, that is unable to come to grips with the many conflicting problems of the metropolitan life and the metropolitan area. Take a look at your own area here. Take a look at any other area. The multiplicity of governmental jurisdictions. If you happen to get the county to agree to a plan, then the city doesn't like it. If you get the city to agree to it, then there's a special jurisdiction like the Port Authority that doesn't like it. If you get the Port Authority on, then the state doesn't like it. And you have one constant set of problems. What do you have to do? Well, we've got a lot of talk about model cities. I suggest model states. First of all, model states. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, let's revise state constitutions. Let's give them the authority to the cities and to the metropolitan areas that are required to raise the funds, to do the planning, to provide the services. There isn't a city in America that has any authority on its own. It gains all of it from its legislature of its state. The child of the state is the city. The city is the child of the state. It has only that which it is granted by legislative act, by constitutional authority or charter. And all this talk about modernization of the American city must start at the state capital and the federal level. And when we start to put the two major partners to working together, state and federal, or federal and state, and then give the authority for municipal and development on new jurisdictions, new legal authorities, we'll begin to get something done. The cost of land is prohibitive for low-income housing. We need an urban homestead act. How did you open America? You have a homestead act for rural America. That's the way many of your grandparents got their start. An urban homestead act to subsidize the high cost of land values so that we can find decent housing for low and middle income groups to take care of their needs and the public services that are required in parks and cultural centers. How do we pay for it? Well, first of all, the growth of the economy, what I call the growth dividend. It will run for the next 2 to 3 years at the rate over and above all contemplated expenditures that we could set aside, $2 to $3 billion in fiscal 70 and 71. By fiscal 72, it could be as high as $30 billion. And that's the kind of an injection of finance that is needed. A massive national commitment. The peace dividend. To bring this war to an end. And to bring this war to an end, to put these resources as quickly as possible into the building and the rebuilding of our urban life. To re-examine and take an inventory of every commitment that this nation has abroad, not to withdraw from the world, but to quit thinking that it's our plum, our pie, our lake. Now I want to leave you with a little story about, I know many of you are deeply concerned about the inadequacy of our whole structure. Remember what Winston Churchill, I got two Churchillian stories, are always, he, with all of his limitations, he really did get on target many times. Churchill once in a debate in the House of Commons was challenged on forms of government, and he said, "Democracy is the worst possible form of government ever tried." The worst possible form of government, except all others that have been ever tried. And I think that when we think about what we have done and what we need to do, that we could be reminded of that sweet little leader of the temperance movement in Britain, who called upon the Prime Minister during the war years. And she and her group were deeply concerned about the consumption of alcoholic beverages by Sir Winston. He was noted for having consumed rather copious quantities of it. And they had a little meeting of their group, and they made an evaluation or an estimate of the volume that he had consumed. And they appointed this dear sweet little old lady in tennis shoes to come and meet with the Prime Minister. And she came in, and he granted her an audience. And she said, "Mr. Prime Minister, I'm here to represent the temperance movement. And we know that you drink large, copious quantities of whiskey and brandy and other alcoholic beverages, and we think it's deplorable. We have estimated the amount that you have consumed, and we have the dimensions of your office. And we have estimated that if all the alcoholic beverage that you've consumed since you were Prime Minister were to be poured into this office, it would come up to about here." And Sir Winston looked at this sweet little old lady and he said, "Is that all you have to say?" And she said, "Yes, what do you have to say?" He looked at where her hand was. He looked to the floor. He looked to the ceiling. He said, "So little have I done, so much is there yet to do." Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very good. I know many of you have 1 o'clock classes, so we'll just take a minute for you to exit through the crowd. There are seats, a few of them up in the front. Those who would like to stay for the question and answers, possibly you could come up and take them. If not, we're just going to wait a few minutes and then commence with the questions. We're going to alternate mics, and if please, you could just ask one question and wait for the answer. Hey, Donna. All right, if you would all try to find a seat and move back from the stage, we'll start with the question and answer period. Please form a line behind the 2 floor mics. That's the easiest place to start from. Yeah, there's someone on the sound. I'm sure. Probably not. Yeah, he's backstage. He's the lavalier. He's the lavalier.
Oh, I gotta walk for a while instead of run. Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
I think he's running for mayor of Minneapolis.
Of the what association? Oh, yes, sir. How do you do? Hello there. Hello there. How do you do? Pleased to see you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
He could have, but he didn't
Thank
want
you,
to
sir.
endanger his career.
Thank you. How do you, sir? Yeah, all set? Let's go. Yeah. You go right ahead.
Why don't we start with the mic on that side of the room? Who's ever standing at the mic, I can't see it. Why don't you ask your question? And if you could all try to sit down, we can start.
I'm not going to get specific. I don't think anything.
Would you please
here-
speak up?
I won't get specific. Nothing here has been specific till now. But I'm going to ask
Where's the
something I
gentleman?
think that is basic. The thing that stood out, you said people are going around saying, you're beautiful when you know they're really not. Well, that's not what it's all about. People aren't beautiful in the way they look. And if you don't understand that, you're not going to start solving any of these problems.
Do we have a question, possibly at this other mic?
In the light of your previous remarks on the necessity to take care and treatment of people, do you seriously, yes or no, believe that there will ever be a Nuremberg trial about the atrocities in Vietnam, and will you be called to answer for your actions there?
I couldn't say whether there would ever be anything like that. If I were to be called, I would surely be more than happy to state what my participation was. I happen to think that we might be a little bit better off to try to kind of look ahead, learn some lessons out of the experiences that we've had, which have been sad and costly experiences, and see if we can't do a little bit better than we did yesterday. I don't have 100 years yet to live. I intend to live every one of them for tomorrow. I don't intend to try to go back and even relive the election, much as I'd like to.
Why don't we just alternate? Is there one on this side of the room?
Yeah. You asked the dissenting Democrats to stay, so I hope this isn't a low blow. But all in all, knowing what you know now, if you could look back for a minute and speak honestly from your heart, do you feel that the war was worth it?
I don't believe anyone could have foreseen at the time of our involvement, which did not start in 1965, but started much sooner, what this war would really come to and what cost it would really entail or take from the American people. I happen to feel that the cost has been very high, and I hope and pray that we can find a prompt and quick answer to it, not only at the negotiating table, but in the de-escalation of this war in Vietnam. The things that have happened, such as the bombing pause, I actively supported. The development of a political infrastructure, which I thought was essential if you were going to have anything that was good out of it, I actively supported. I only think that history can give you the honest, objective answer to your question. I'm too deeply involved to do anything else but to be somewhat subjective. I did what I thought was right. I have not lived a life of private or public hypocrisy. I have made my mistakes, but they have not been mistakes, may I say, of the heart. They may at times have been mistakes of miscalculation, but public integrity to me is as important as intellectual integrity, and I've tried to have it to the best of my ability.
Professor Humphrey, you talked about people getting their facts straight before they ask questions, so first I'm going to get the facts straight and then I'll ask the question.
Just
Question-
one.
Yeah. Okay. The question regards the pace of desegregation of the public school system in Mississippi under the Democratic administration during its years in power. The latest statistics that I have seen, which are as of about 15 months ago by the Federal Commission on Civil Rights, state that 47% of the Mississippi public school districts are in compliance with the Supreme Court order on desegregation. They also state in the Commission's pamphlet on racial isolation in public schools that precisely 2.5% of all black elementary and secondary school students in Mississippi attend schools where there is even one white person. Okay, now, These figures are as of approximately the 1st of January 1967. By that time, the Democratic administrations had been in power for roughly 6 years. And the pace set up at this rate would be that from 1954 to that date, the pace would mean it will take 5 centuries to get the public school system desegregated. If all the change occurred only under the Democrats and not under the Republicans, it would take a mere 2.5 centuries. My question is that in power, did men like Robert Francis Kennedy not push hard enough, or is this the pace which we must stick to?
Well, if you want to know whether I think the pace is fast enough, the answer is no. That's for sure. As a matter of fact, I spent a good deal of my life in Congress trying to expedite many things. It took 16 years, for example, to get a Medicare program. I didn't think the pace was nearly good enough. I introduced the civil rights legislation as the first senator in 1949. We passed it in 1964. I don't think the pace was nearly good enough. We had 83 days of debate. I thought we ought to have been able to do it in 3. I didn't think the pace was nearly fast enough. But I'll tell you what, we made some progress, and we made the breakthroughs, and it has a way of moving in geometrical proportions, like compound interest. And we are beginning to make progress, and the important thing is to keep on the pressure, and to keep on the pressure, Democrats or Republicans in Congress, in the executive branch. I think we've got a lot of things to apologize for not having done well enough. But we lived within the political milieu of what was possible. I lost every southern state in this last election because I said that I would not slow down the pace, that I would indeed step up the pace. I paid a high price for it. And the man who is now President of the United States said during that time that the pace needed to be slowed down. I'm happy to tell you that since he became President, he hasn't slowed down the pace. More power to him. But that goes back to the other question. Political integrity. I was asked from the platforms in Jacksonville, Florida, in Charlotte, North Carolina, in Louisville, in Atlanta, and in many other places, Mr. Vice President, are you for the Department of HEW's guidelines? Do you think we're going too fast? Do you think we're going too slow? I said we're not going fast enough and they need to be enforced. Well, I didn't carry any of the southern states, but it was politically honorable, even if I suffered an ignominious defeat. But I think I've answered your question to the best of my ability.
Mr. Humphrey. Mr. Humphrey, would you comment on the Walker Report of what happened in Chicago?
I think it's the best report and the most objective analysis that's been written on that tragic situation, and I hope it'll be studied for more than its headlines.
Mr. Humphrey, something you said during last summer in Chicago has been bothering me for a long time. While you were in your hotel room, the Los Angeles Times quoted you as saying, at the time of the demonstrations, that those people downstairs who were demonstrating didn't represent the majority feeling in the United States. And in effect, what I think that did was it practically condoned what the police were doing at the time. And I'd like you to explain this.
Well, I don't condone brutality on the part of anybody. I do not condone violence. I don't recall having said that, but if I didn't, I maybe should have. Because I don't happen to think that what was going on in terms of the violence and in terms of the protest represented the majority opinion of the United States. I don't think that's the case. I don't say that I want it quite clear. I think there were literally hundreds and thousands of people that were there that were deeply distressed with what was going on in the Democratic Party, that had honest feelings of conviction and felt strongly about the war and strongly in opposition to the administration's policy, and they had every right to do so and every right to be there. But let me make it very clear to you, sir, that there was a hardcore group that were determined that they were going to have some trouble, and they generally get it. And I want to, well, it's entirely possible that there may have been 2 hardcore groups.
Mr. Humphrey, I've been curious to know what happened to the MDTA program under President Johnson. And
What was
do you
that again? The what?
The MDTA program. And what do you think
What
about
program?
Manpower Development and Training
yes,
Act?
MDTA. Pardon me. All right. Yes, sir.
What do you think its future potential is?
Well, I think it's done well. I think it's all a matter of funding, whether the resources are put to it. It has been very beneficial. It's helped train and retrain over 1 million workers, and I believe that's been a very constructive achievement, and I hope that it'll be expanded. That's the Manpower Development and Training Act, which has been a great deal of help, particularly for persons that have been moved from one skill to another or persons that had no skills. Yes, sir.
This side.
You spoke today about the shortage of funds and the need for more projects to end poverty in America. And I'm sure we all share with you the need for these changes to be done soon. But I think you failed to mention perhaps what I think is the main reason why we cannot carry on these programs. As long as the United States is spending $70 billion a year, almost 10% of its gross national product on war, as long as we have our armies all over the world and we are dedicated to this sort of holy crusade of fighting communism, I think perhaps we cannot carry on these projects, and this is the main reason. I'd like to ask you perhaps something which you can do now as you're no longer a vice president to contradict the president. Do you think we can have guns and butter? Can we carry on these wars? Can we carry on this crusade of anti-communism, of war, this constant thing which has been going on for the last 20 years, and still have butter and build up America and make it a much better place? Can we have both?
Well, you have described the situation as you wanted it. Let me try to answer it as I would like to. First of all, I'm not going to let you or anybody else off the hook too easy about what we can afford in this country, because we can afford a good deal more than we're doing. I don't happen to be very much of a person for guns. I've been spending a lot of my time in the field of disarmament. I'm trying right now to get university audiences and others interested in the anti-ballistic missile program so that this thing isn't launched to envelop us once again in a very costly defense expenditure. I said as a candidate for the office of president that if I were elected, I would immediately take an inventory of our commitments around this world and find which ones had priority and meaning in terms of contemporary conditions and which ones should be abandoned. In other words, to tidy up the house, to try to remove some of the extravagant costs that we obviously have, and as I indicated a moment here ago, not to try to be the master of the world, but rather to be a partner in this world. I happen to think that can be done. I must say that many a person today I've heard in and out of Congress say, well, we can't afford, Mr. Humphrey, to do anything about daycare centers. We can't afford community health centers, Mr. Humphrey, because 10% of our budget goes for defense. Well, I wish 10% didn't go, but let me tell you, that's one of the lowest defense budgets of any of the major nations. And we've got 90% left over. I mean, 10% of our economic GNP. We still have 90% left over. I'd like to see that percentage sharply reduced, but I want to make sure in the meantime that we don't give some people an easy out, who when you reduce that budget still are not for daycare centers, and still are not for educational programs, and still are unwilling to do something about the cities. Let me give you a little experience. It's some advantage in the experience. I served in the Congress after the Korean War and during the Korean War, and I heard all the arguments. And they said, well, once we get this war over that was taking 14% of the GNP, and then 16% of the GNP, once that we get that over, then we will be doing these wonderful things. Well, what happened when the war was over? I'll tell you what happened. Some of the folks that were voters went to sleep. The Congress didn't act. There was a new administration. Taxes were sharply reduced, and there wasn't a single anti-poverty program. There was nothing done in terms of federal aid to education. There was no launching of an attack upon the problems of pollution. There were no student scholarship loans. There was no public housing of any consequence. They just relaxed. Now, I'm not about ready to let somebody sell me that bill of goods again. I prefer not to have 10% of this budget for military purposes. I prefer it much less. But I want to tell you something. If we're going to indulge in that kind of thing called militarism on the one hand, the military budget, then I want you to indulge in a little bit of this civilian activity on the other hand. And how do we pay for it? And we can. Tax reform. There hasn't been a tax reform measure introduced for years. And all administrations, Republican and Democrat alike, are guilty. Now, I can speak with some integrity on this because I fought the battle of tax reform and found out that there were only 26 votes in the United States Senate. I had as my partner one of the most brilliant economists in America at that time, Senator Paul Douglas. And we had major tax legislation before the Congress at the time of the Korean War. And instead of plugging loopholes, they opened some new ones. The middle income group in this country today is in a taxpayer's revolt. There are loopholes big enough in our tax laws to drive a semi-truck through. And that's where you're going to get some of this money. And may I say that instead of just trying to see how we're going to federate the whole world, which if we can get around to that, we'll work on it, would you concentrate your attention on tax reform for a while? And maybe we can build amongst young Americans that are voters, so that will be voters or are voters, a kind of consciousness so that when a man runs for Congress, the next time you'll say, Mr. Congressman, how do you stand on this tax bill and that tax bill and this issue and that issue, instead of always saying, now how do you stand on weapons, napalm, and so on, all of which is important, all of which you ought to ask him. But give him a little of the double treatment, would you? Both international and domestic, because if you don't, mark my words, there's enough movement in this country to keep the military budget big. I've been in Washington 20 years and I know. The question is there enough social force in this country and ferment and enough activist political action in this country to keep the civilian programs moving? Is there enough to put concentration where it ought to be? And you're going to determine that. But you're not going to determine it unless you start talking about it, unless you understand what you're talking about. Tax reform, the dedication of funds for critical programs. That's one of the ways we'll do what we're talking about here today.
We
Mr.
have
Humphrey.
time for about one more question, and it's from this side.
I'd like to ask you a question, but you'll have to clarify a point for me first.
Yes, sir.
You seem to be saying hooray for people and very happy about people, and yet you criticize Robert Taft and the legislature for giving into public opinion vis-a-vis the housing. Now, what do you really mean by the public opinion that they're considering?
Well, I wasn't trying to criticize Robert Taft. I was trying to pat him on the back. I'm very grateful for his leadership of the Housing Act.
Well,
What
you
I
mentioned the
What I was saying
legislature.
is, sir, that legislators generally vote what is the prevailing popular will, public opinion. But the purpose of an education and the purpose of political action is to change public opinion.
Well,
if
now
you
what do you
feel
mean by
strongly
public
about
opinion?
it.
Are you talking about special interest groups, pressure groups? You mentioned the Port Authority. I'll mention the National Rifle Association and the John Birch Society for two more.
Yes, I don't
And
like either
there's
one
a
of
great
those last
problem
two.
in this country that... Oh, okay. And there seems to be a great problem in this country that most of the force brought upon the legislators in the Capitol comes from special interest groups. Now, how do you suppose that we can subvert this and get around it? What are we going to do?
Well, may I say, first of all, you're right. Most of the pressure that's brought to bear upon many of the legislators is from a group that has a particular special interest. Now, not all special interests are, in my book, bad. For example, to save the redwoods, that was a special interest group, and I was interested in it. I thought it was a good idea that we ought to save them. There's a special interest group in this country that happens to feel that we ought to do a great deal more about conservation and the dedication of public lands for the purposes of national parks. I'm for that. I think you have to make your choice as to what kind of a society you want. Now, there's going to be a very strong group, for example, in America, that's going to try to convince you and convince me that you're going to get more defense, that you're going to feel more secure out of an anti-ballistic missile program. I just don't think you are, and I'm going to go around this country and argue the other way, and I know a little something about it. Now, that's two special interests, but I like mine better. And I think that's the way that you have to have conflicting interests. And when you come to tax laws, and this is very dangerous to say out here in California, but there are such things as we call depletion allowances. Are they too much or are they too little? Is the capital gain structure in the tax law equitable? Are some of these loopholes that permit, that really aggravate mergers, that permit companies that have made large amounts of money to go in and buy a company that's lost money and thereby to absorb the losses in order to pay less taxes, thereby increasing the rate of merger at the same time that the Justice Department is prosecuting them for merger? Does that make much sense? I think not. Now, I'd like to do something about that. And how are we going to do it? Like meetings like this. Not in a moment. We're going to have to study it. We're going to have to look into it. And I want some of the enthusiasm that the student bodies of American colleges have directed towards these constructive things. Do you think it'd be better in America if there were community health centers for the poor people of this country and for others? Do you think it'd be better in America if working mothers could have daycare centers where they could put their children and not to leave them on the streets of the ghetto? Do you think it'd be better in America if we did have a program where people could both own or rent a decent home regardless of income? I think so. Do you think it'd be better in America to have a form of income maintenance that did not denigrate and downgrade and humiliate the poor people of this country? I think so. Is a negative income tax good or bad? Is a form of income maintenance good or bad? We ought to study it. And this is where young Americans are going to come into their own in terms of political maturity. Somebody said, should we have the 18-year-old vote? I think so. I've advocated it for years. But I want to be sure that 18-year-olds know that what they're voting about. And I want to be sure that they know that they're voting on crucial issues, not just the issues of peace and war, which are frequently dramatized in very, very bold terms, but the nitty-gritty of what an appropriation bill is about. You can have all the dreams in the world about model cities, but if you can't get any money, you're not going to get any model cities. And when I stop to think of what happened in the Congress of the United States, when I know that there were 14,000 cases of infectious, dangerous rat bite reported to public hospitals in 1967, and one congressman got up and laughed the whole bill out of Congress when we tried to appropriate a few $1 million to help cities clean out rodents. Now, if you want something that you can do now, well, I'll tell you, you can kill rats, and we know how to do it. And we got the money to do it, and we have the program to do it. Simple things, may I say. These are things that I think students can get activated on, as well as Vietnam and Biafra. And by the way, I hope that you'll do a lot about that. I think the Biafran relief program is vital. But may I suggest that there's some hungry people in California? We can feed both. We've got enough to do both, and I'm not going to let the young man off the hook. A country that can build racetracks, saloons, country clubs, and by the way, I've been to all of them. A country that can do that can also build hospitals and daycare centers and schools and kindergartens and preschool programs. We have what it takes to do it. And all you have to do is take a look at the waste in this country, and you know that with more commitment and with better priorities, we'd get it done. And that's not fancy talk, it's hard, plain talk. I suggest that we start to get at the things that we can do something about. And then we'll build ourselves up to do something about the bigger things. I guess that's enough.
Thank you very much. Thank you.